The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was characterized by strict social norms and severe morality that influenced every aspect of life, especially regarding courtship and marriage. Men and women adhered to a rigid protocol where any physical contact, even the most innocent, was strongly condemned. Courtship was a dance of calculated glances and gestures, and the slightest transgression could result in social rejection. Despite the facade of virtue, the wedding night was, for many women, a moment filled with anxiety and confusion. The lack of sexual education and the absence of information about intimacy left brides vulnerable to traumatic experiences. The case of Effie Gray, whose union with John Ruskin was annulled due to the inability to consummate the marriage, illustrates the harsh reality of this ignorance. Social expectations of purity and the repression of any sexual desire or need transformed marriage into an institution fraught with emotional and physical suffering for many women. The Victorian marriage market, status and fortune. During the Victorian era, marriage was much more than an act of love. In the social and economic context of the 19th century, particularly between 1837 and 1901, marriage was seen as a fundamental transaction, a deal that not only defined the personal destiny of the individuals involved, but also impacted family structures, social status, and financial stability. Far from being a purely romantic act, married life was imbued with a pragmatic logic that prioritized economic welfare, social security, and family perpetuation over emotional considerations. In a society with strict social expectations, courtship became a formal and calculated process. The debut season for young women, primarily in London, served as a social showcase where women were introduced to potential husbands. At these events, such as high society balls and dinners, mothers and matchmakers played key roles in seeking advantageous marriages, both economically and socially. Relationships were built not only on mutual attraction, but also on the strategic alliances forged between families. Victorian marriage was a legal act as detailed as any commercial transaction. Women's dowries, often meticulously negotiated, were seen as an essential component of the union. These dowries represented tangible capital, a decisive factor that could guarantee a family's stability or, conversely, ruin a woman's prospects. A woman's financial well-being depended not just on her character or ability to generate affection, but on what she brought in terms of inheritances and properties. The pragmatic approach to marriage was also supported by a series of manuals and social guides dictating the rules of courtship and married life. Books like The Book of Household Management by Mrs. Beeton provided exhaustive instructions on how to behave in social interactions, how to evaluate a prospective husband, and how to navigate the complexities of married life. These texts, highly popular at the time, helped shape women's conduct, guiding them not only in household details, but in how to meet the strict social and economic standards imposed by Victorian society. The Victorian chaperone, custodians of honor and social norms. In Victorian England, where morality and reputation governed all, the chaperone played a crucial role, ensuring compliance with strict social norms and protecting women from the dangers of scandal. This discreet but essential figure monitored social interactions and ensured that young women did not overstep the boundaries imposed by society. The chaperone not only accompanied young women to social events such as balls and outings, but also served as a protective shield against any behavior deemed inappropriate. In a society where women's public behavior was under constant scrutiny, any misstep could cost them their reputation. For young debutantes, the presence of a chaperone was indispensable for navigating this world of strict conventions. The chaperone figure emerged as a response to the Victorian obsession with purity and decorum. Whether they were family members, married friends, or male relatives, these social guardians ensured that women adhered to the rules of conduct imposed upon them. This practice was also reflected in the literature of the era, such as in the works of Jane Austen and Edith Wharton, where chaperones served as moral moderators. This role of vigilance not only protected women, but also preserved social order. In a society where reputation was essential for acceptance, the chaperone ensured that women's behavior remained within established boundaries. Without their presence, the risk of scandal was imminent. Although by the late 19th century the role of the chaperone lost relevance during its peak, it was a fundamental pillar of social interactions. Chaperones were more than mere observers. They acted as guardians of public morality, ensuring that the social rules of the time were respected and that women behaved according to the strict expectations of their era. The secret language of Victorian courtship: fans, flowers, and silenced desires. In Victorian England, courtship was not merely a dance of furtive glances, but an intricate system of unspoken rules, where every gesture and object could convey what words dared not express. The society of the time was steeped in extreme refinement, and within this context, courtship became a choreography of delicate movements and gestures laden with meaning. Through fine etiquette, the deepest emotions were concealed in a silent ballet of fans, curtsies, and above all, flowers, which served as encoded messages of forbidden desires and secret affections. One of the most emblematic elements of Victorian courtship was the fan. Far from being merely an accessory for warmth, the fan in a lady's hand could convey a wide range of emotions. A closed fan held before the eyes signaled regret or apology. An open and swaying fan could suggest interest, or, conversely, a quick glance through the fan might indicate disinterest or disdain. This precise language required a profound understanding of unwritten rules, and those who failed to follow these conventions risked their reputation or being misunderstood. Similarly, gentlemen had their own set of movements and rituals. The bow, for instance, was not merely a nod of the head, but a manifestation of respect or, in certain cases, desire. Even the depth of the bow could alter its meaning. A light bow was a sign of courtesy, but a deeper inclination might express greater romantic interest. These gestures were so institutionalized that rules on proper gentlemanly behavior were compiled in various manuals, such as Cecil Hartley's, detailing etiquette norms that had to be perfectly followed to avoid social scandals. While these codes might seem rigid and even artificial, they actually formed the basis of a complex and sophisticated form of communication. Even the deepest feelings, those deemed inappropriate for open expression by society, were channeled through this elaborate language of gestures. The most genuine emotions were masked by the surface of these rituals, maintaining composure and decorum while delivering a clear message to those who could read between the lines. The language of flowers, known as floriography, was another fascinating method of clandestine expression in Victorian courtship. While the red rose was a universal symbol of love, other flowers conveyed much more nuanced and complex messages. For instance, a bouquet of violets could express faithfulness, while an orchid signified rare and profound love. Ivy, a symbol of fidelity, or rosemary, representing remembrance, were used to send poetic messages without the need for words. In a world where freedom of expression was severely restricted by social conventions, the floral language provided a refuge for those who wished to communicate their feelings beyond the constraints of etiquette. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, for example, exchanged tussie-mussies, small bouquets of flowers, as part of their courtship, reflecting the widespread use of flowers as a secret language among lovers. The art of Victorian courtship, through letters, dances, and tea. It was in letters, dances, and afternoon teas that the most complex love stories were woven, where the rules of etiquette and personal desire intertwined in a precise social choreography. The letter in the Victorian era was much more than a means of communication. It was the vehicle through which feelings of love, desire, and despair could be expressed without risking the sender's reputation. Thanks to the invention of the penny post in 1840, which allowed letters to be sent for just a penny, epistolary communication flourished, and young lovers found in the pen a way to court without public exposure. Advice on writing romantic letters abounded at the time. Manuals like The Polite Letter Writer by Lady Elizabeth Scott, 1850, instructed young women on the importance of balancing emotional openness with caution, ensuring that no expressed sentiment could lead to scandal. Love letters followed a very specific format. They began with formal greetings such as "My dear Miss" or "Honourable Sir," then developed into elaborate sentences that, while not excessively direct, subtly conveyed the sender's affection. Phrases like, "Your absence casts a shadow over my days," or "I find myself irresistibly drawn to your company," allowed feelings to be understood without breaching rigid social norms. Some famous romances, such as that of poets Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning, exemplified the power of letters to nurture deep and confidential love. In fact, Browning's letters are considered one of the most notable examples of Victorian courtship, a testament to how written words could forge a relationship amidst social restrictions. The act of letter-locking folding letters intricately to create their own envelope was another popular technique of the time. This elaborate method not only protected the letters from being opened without permission, but also reflected the importance of privacy in an environment where personal secrets could easily be exposed. The Victorian ballroom was the primary stage where social rules and desire met. At these events, the dance card played a crucial role. It was not merely a list of potential dance partners, but a map of social courtship, a tool that dictated the interactions and romantic possibilities of the evening. Each name inscribed on a dance card was an opportunity for young women, under the watchful eyes of their families and society's scrutiny, to choose with whom to share those moments of public interaction. Victorian dances were deeply structured events, and the dance card was the key to their choreography. This small card, pencil in hand, allowed young women to assign dances with gentlemen based on social importance, status, or in some cases, personal desire. Being included on a lady's dance card was an honor, a step closer to potentially consolidating a relationship, or even in certain cases, the acceptance of a marriage proposal. The dance, with its various steps, such as the waltz, which was far more intimate than a quadrille, served as a metaphor for the complex social games dictating romantic opportunities. The importance of this ritual was such that even Queen Victoria, before ascending the throne, participated in this social game with her cousin, Prince Albert. At a ball in 1839, it is said that the young prince carefully observed Victoria's dance card, noting with whom she danced and how the evening unfolded. Thus, the ball was not merely an opportunity for entertainment, but an act of social strategy. In addition to dances and letters, afternoon tea became another key setting in the ritual of Victorian courtship. Inspired by Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, who introduced this tradition in the 1830s, the tea ceremony transformed into an intimate space where personal relationships could be cultivated in a tranquil environment, less public than the ballroom. Here, young gentlemen could finally approach ladies under the pretext of sharing a cup of tea and engage in deeper conversations. Etiquette for behavior at these gatherings was strict and detailed. Manuals like The Book of Household Management by Isabella Beeton provided precise instructions on the protocol to follow. From proper attire to the order of serving tea, every aspect of the meeting had to be in place. For men, afternoon tea was an opportunity to demonstrate their courting skills without the physical constraints of dance, but equally loaded with symbolism. Visits, or calls, were another fundamental social ritual for couples advancing in their relationship. These visits often took place at specific times of the day, according to the norms of proper conduct, and men had to present their calling card, a small piece of paper with their name, as a sign of respect and consideration. During these visits, the couple could enjoy some time alone, away from the hustle and bustle of balls and larger social gatherings. However, as with letters and dances, visits were subject to the strict social norms regulating behavior and commitment. The alchemy of Victorian engagements, love, dowries, and diamonds. Engagement during the Victorian era was not merely an act of love. It was an intricate social and financial contract connecting destinies, families, and reputations. In a world where the rules of courtship were dictated by strict codes of conduct, the act of becoming engaged was a complex phenomenon that intertwined the deepest emotions with the demands of social standing. This process of transformation, where love crystallized into gold, land, and prestige, formed the cornerstone of the Victorian institution of marriage. In the social fabric of the era, the dowry was not simply a gift from the bride's family to the groom, but an essential component of the marital exchange. In Victorian England, the dowry was regarded as a chest of material assets, often including land, properties, and an annual income, making it a fundamental economic consideration. This practice had evolved over centuries, and by the 19th century, the families of engaged women were exceedingly meticulous in negotiating the terms surrounding it. Prenuptial contracts, which detailed the conditions of the dowry and financial agreements, were meticulously crafted to ensure that marriage was both a personal union and an economic transaction. The diary of Samuel Pepys in the 17th century already highlighted the importance of dowries as a decisive factor in a woman's desirability for marriage. However, it was during the Victorian era that this element gained even greater complexity. Dowries not only represented the bride's fortune, but also signified the financial stability and social status of both families involved. Beyond properties and material wealth, parental consent, especially in the case of women from high society, was a crucial part of the arrangement. The pressure for parental approval of the engagement, and often the marriage itself, reflected how love was intrinsically tied to social expectations. Marriage did not merely unite two individuals, but also joined two families, with the dowry serving as the tangible manifestation of that connection. The engagement of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in 1839 marked a significant milestone in the history of courtship and royal marriage. Victoria, who held a position of power as monarch, defied the conventions of the time by proposing marriage herself. Instead of following the traditions of grand balls or public events, the proposal was private, conducted in the quiet of Windsor Castle, making it even more meaningful. This act not only altered the dynamics of royal courtship, but also broke the tradition that the man must take the initiative in such moments. Although private, the engagement quickly gained public visibility when newspapers like The Times announced the royal union, solidifying the new relationship and elevating the couple to an even higher social level. Thus, engagement was not only the beginning of a personal union, but also a public declaration of status, power, and the validation of both parties' positions in society. The engagement ring is one of the most recognizable symbols of marital promise, but its history in the Victorian context is marked by symbolism and significant changes in the jewelry industry. While diamonds are now considered the standard for engagement rings, this was not always the case in the Victorian era. When Prince Albert proposed to Queen Victoria, he gifted her a ring shaped like a snake, a figure that symbolized eternity. This choice was significant, as the snake ring represented enduring union, reflecting not only the depth of their commitment but also a broader vision of love beyond mere luxury. It was in the late 19th century, with the discovery of diamond mines in South Africa, that diamonds became firmly associated with the idea of eternal love. In this context, jewelry companies led by brands such as De Beers began promoting marketing campaigns linking diamonds with matrimonial engagements. This marketing effort, combined with the increased availability of diamonds, cemented the diamond as the undisputed symbol of eternal love, overshadowing even the more symbolic choices like the snake. Once the terms of the engagement were agreed upon, the event itself was conducted with a formality that underscored its social significance. Engagement ceremonies, although often small family gatherings or intimate luncheons, could also be occasions where symbolic gifts of great sentimental value were exchanged. These might include family heirlooms, prayer books, or lockets containing portraits. Such objects not only sealed the engagement, but also acquired deep meaning, uniting the families through a tangible legacy of shared promises. Engagement announcements in newspapers such as the Morning Post and the Times played a crucial role in making the couple visible to society. These public notices served as official declarations of the union, elevating the couple's social standing and solidifying their place within the intricate web of Victorian social expectations. Silent love, the romantic labyrinth of Victorian desires and morality. Victorian love was presented as a carefully choreographed dance, where passion had to be constrained beneath a veil of strict social and moral norms. Romantic relationships, although intensely emotional, were limited by a complex set of unspoken rules that governed every gesture, word, and glance. Courtship was not just a form of attraction, but a minefield where the slightest misstep could trigger scandals that tarnished the reputations of those involved, especially women. In this context, love was not merely an emotional bond, but a playing field where social codes, morality, and reputation intertwined, forming a labyrinth in which human desires were constantly suppressed and redirected. The literature of the era mirrored these tensions. Writers like Jane Austen offered a portrayal of love that, while idealized, was not devoid of conflict. In her novels, courtship unfolded within the boundaries of social expectations, yet always hinted at the internal struggle of characters navigating between their desires and the external demands of society. In Austen's stories, Characters who challenged norms, such as Mr. Darcy or Elizabeth Bennet, were not only romantic figures but also symbols of human resilience against the rigid structures of their environment. Conversely, the Bronte sisters presented a much darker and more passionate version of love. The relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine in Wuthering Heights stood as the antithesis of Austen's idealization. Here, love was not merely an attraction, but an obsession that transcended social norms and often destroyed them. The love between Bronte's protagonists became a destructive force, one that defied moral and social conventions, revealing the dangers of unrestrained desire. This narrative stood in stark contrast to the gentleness of romantic comedies, opening the door to exploring more intense and inherently perilous passions. The contrast between Austen's perspectives and those of the Brontes reflected the tensions of an era in which, while love was an ideal, it did not always fit within established molds. While Victorian romances often celebrated virtue, duty, and restraint, there were also expressions of desire that escaped the boundaries of morality. George Eliot's novels, such as Middlemarch, soberly and realistically depicted how marriage, ostensibly the culmination of romantic love, often ended up stifling individuality and freedom. In Middlemarch, love was not only an aspiration, but also an institution that could crush the hopes and dreams of those caught in their own decisions. At the same time, the phenomenon of serialized novels captured the public's attention, creating collective anticipation over the fates of characters. Works like Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, published in installments, became a form of mass romanticism. Readers speculated over Pip's fate and his relationship with Estella, building an emotional connection that transcended the pages. These stories, though fictional, provided an avenue for escape and reflection on the dilemmas of unrequited love, unattainable passion, and the limitations of human relationships. Outside the literary sphere, the language of desire in everyday life was also shaped by the need for subterfuge. In Victorian society, love was communicated indirectly and symbolically. The use of flowers, the language of the fan, and even the placement of a glove on the hand became codes for expressing feelings that could not be spoken aloud. The simple act of exchanging glances or touching hands could carry profound meanings, emphasizing the fragility of romantic relationships in an environment of constant social scrutiny. Beneath this surface of control and moderation, however, emerged realms of love that defied norms. Writers and artists such as Oscar Wilde and the Pre-Raphaelites began to explore the shadows of love, pushing emotions to their extremes. Wilde, in his works, not only criticized the social restrictions of his time but also addressed themes of homosexual desire, which were profoundly subversive in his era. With his sharp wit, Wilde became a symbol of the fight for emotional and sexual freedom, challenging the rigid moral norms of Victorian society. In intellectual and bohemian circles of the time, love began to take freer, more experimental forms. The Molly houses, clandestine spaces where homosexual men gathered, offered a setting for exploring dimensions of love that not only challenged the morality of the era, but also gave visibility to a segment of society forced to remain hidden. In these underground environments, love was an act of resistance, a direct challenge to the heteronormativity that dominated Victorian culture. This hidden and often repressed love was also reflected in the lives of figures such as Catherine Dickens, whose public separation from Charles Dickens in 1858 was a scandal that shattered the facade of the stable family life so highly valued by society. Events like these revealed the reality behind the polished image of domestic life, demonstrating that love did not always align with social expectations and that human passions and desires could not always be contained by Victorian moral norms. Between shadow and passion, the wedding night and the silenced secrets of Victorian sexuality. In the Victorian era, the concepts of sex and the wedding night were profoundly shaped by strict social norms and rigid moral expectations governing daily life. While Victorian society was renowned for its devotion to virtue and morality, sexuality was far from straightforward. It was shrouded in a dense veil of repression, taboos, and often ignorance. Sexual acts within marriage, particularly on the wedding night, were marked by the expectation that the woman should be pure, and in many cases a kind of sexual tabula rasa. The prevailing notion was that women were to be ignorant or innocent of carnal pleasures, and sex within marriage was often seen as a duty rather than a source of pleasure, especially for women. The Victorian wedding night was an event laden with symbolism and expectation, but also considerable anxiety and mystery. In many cases, it was not a moment of unrestrained passion, but rather a ritualized formality in which the newlyweds engaged in an act that was rarely discussed openly. The general expectation was that the bride, who was usually a virgin at the time of marriage, would surrender her honor to her husband. In this context, sexual intercourse was viewed not only as the consummation of marriage, but also as an act of ownership. The husband claimed his wife, and penetration was often perceived as a physical transaction in which the woman's virginity was conquered. Despite moral expectations, sex within Victorian marriages was often tinged with anxiety, discomfort, and ignorance. Women were socially conditioned to repress their desires and view sex as a means of procreation rather than pleasure. Female pleasure was regarded with suspicion and, in many cases, entirely disregarded. The idea that a woman could enjoy sexual activity was considered inappropriate and even immoral. Victorian medicine, heavily influenced by religious morality, not only suppressed women's sexual desire but also pathologized it. Female hysteria was openly discussed as a condition thought to afflict women who exhibited excessive sexual desire or passion. To treat this supposed disorder, some physicians recommended pelvic massage or manual stimulation, a practice that could be seen as a primitive form of medical masturbation carried out by doctors in their offices. Meanwhile, men, though equally bound by societal expectations, had greater freedom to express their desire and fulfill the sexual roles expected in marriage. Men were generally expected to initiate sexual activity and were often encouraged to seek pleasure in the marital relationship. However, this did not exempt them from social taboos, as they too were pressured to conform to Victorian ideals of respectability and self-control. Sexual acts within marriage were also strictly regulated by law, which prohibited adultery and, in some cases, even intercourse outside of marriage. Victorian morality enforced strict anti-sodomy laws, with severe penalties for those who violated established sexual norms, particularly regarding homosexual relationships or sexual practices deemed non-reproductive. Sexuality was closely tied to reproduction, and women were primarily seen as reproducers, responsible for bringing children into the world, while men enjoyed greater freedom to explore their sexuality within legal boundaries. In addition to social morality, sexual censorship extended to literature and media. Books and literary works that addressed themes of sexuality or extramarital relationships were often censored, and discussions of sex in Victorian society were extremely limited. Thus, sex existed primarily in the private sphere, surrounded by profound silence or moral rhetoric that framed it as dirty, dangerous, or at the very least something to be kept strictly within private bounds. Men were also influenced by norms that deprived them of the freedom to explore their desires openly. In the Victorian era, a rigid masculinity was often promoted, emphasizing total self-control and emotional detachment. The idea that men should be strong and restrained often led to frustration in their sexual relationships, particularly if their wives failed to meet expectations of desire or sexual responsiveness. Male frustration sometimes found an outlet in prostitutes or clandestine brothels, where upper-class men often sought to satisfy their desires covertly, as societal conventions limited their freedom within marriage. The repression of sexuality was a hallmark of Victorian society, but it was not absolute. While men could seek satisfaction through prostitution or extramarital relationships, women were trapped in a double standard. They were expected to be pure and at best silent about sex. However, not all was repression. In less normative circles or marginalized sectors of society, sexual desires found liberation from moral oppression. Bohemian circles, art, and literature, though marginal, served as outlets for those who could not conform to Victorian expectations, finding in sensuality or what society deemed perverse a way to express what was hidden. The wedding night in the Victorian context was not merely a social formality, but a battleground where public expectations, religious beliefs, anatomy, and sexual ignorance clashed. Despite repression and control, there were both public and private avenues for escape that offered glimpses of transgression against the strict sexual norms of the era. Repression did not eliminate sexual desires. It merely drove them into the shadows, where they wove themselves in silence, waiting to be discovered.